Good afternoon or early evening, and welcome to our first session on global dialogue, happiness, and well-being, which is tied to a report that's been put out. We're focusing, and I'm thrilled to actually do this, on the impact of your city on your life, and we'll drill into that in our conversation. I'm John Defterios. I'm emerging markets editor for CNN, based in Abu Dhabi. Spend a great deal of time here in Dubai. It's great to have Mayor Gleam Davis from Santa Monica, California. I'm a Californian. My family lives in Santa Barbara, so know the work you've been doing very well. Charles Montgomery wrote a book on the Happy City. Am I correct on that? Yeah, the Happy City, which has turned into a consultancy which goes around trying to find out what are the best policies for making an impact on your life in a city. I think it's a fair description. We'll let them drill down, but let's give them a warm welcome to the World Government Summit. These gooseneck mics are very directional, but you have to keep them pretty close. So Gleam, if you want to bring this up, that would be terrific. Right. We have 18 and a half minutes. I'd love to get into the incubator of your well-being, right? Let's start with you, Charles, because you do this on a worldwide basis, having different people and colleagues going around the world to find out which are the right policies for the right size city, I think is the best way to describe it. But is there a greater recognition now, and it certainly seems to be the case, whether it's a city like Shanghai or a smaller city like Santa Monica, what are the right policies? What's the right fit to create the ideal circumstances for a citizen? Please start.
It's funny. Yes, I run a consultancy, but I actually feel that we've become part of a movement. And indeed, cities around the world are discovering that we made a lot of bad mistakes in the 20th century. We built a lot of bad cities, and by that I mean cities that were bad for our health, bad for our psychological well-being, bad for social connections, places that weren't resilient. Basically, I'm talking about the American model of city building. Phoenix, South Florida. We're turning around now, and part of the reason we're turning around is that decision makers are seeing that it's time to take the evidence that links well-being and urban design and act on it. And actually, they're doing it now in the UAE. You know, Minister of State for Happiness, Her Excellency Huda Al-Rumi, is working specifically to create a new set of guidelines to build happier communities right here.
Good. In the case of Santa Monica, Gleam, what are the key indicators for your happy incubator? Let's put it that way. What do you see as the key incubator efforts here to make it the right container for people to live in, and some of the struggles that you have as well?
Sure. Well, we have a couple of issues. We're a very small city, less than 9 square miles, about 93,000 residents. And what we have done is we have started measuring our residents at well-being. And what we've discovered is anything that you can measure, you can improve. So we do a well-being survey every 2 years. We started it with money from Bloomberg Philanthropies. And we measure everything from kindergarten readiness in our youth to sense of isolation in our seniors and everything in between. And so what we've tried to do is use that data to drive programs where they're the most needed. Obviously, like any city, we have a limited amount of resources to vote to the idea of well-being or health. And so what we've tried to do is figure out where can we spend those resources and get the most bang for our buck. And one of the things we've done, for example, is work with partners such as the RAND Corporation, which is an international R&D firm, and Fitbit, to provide Fitbits to people in some of our least active communities so they can become more aware of how much they're moving, that sort of thing.
Good. Do you have a conflict amongst your citizenry that think that this is a good idea to measure well-being, and some who have lived, and I know Santa Monica quite well, have lived there, families have been there for a century, who say we don't want to really embrace the future. We're quite happy the way things are. You mentioned a point in our pre-discussion that people are really against any sort of density. They want to keep the beach life, low-rise living the way it is.
That's right. I think we have people in our community who are used to that traditional Los Angeles model of we should drive everywhere. And part of well-being is getting people out of their automobiles and into a more active lifestyle. And part of that is building more density so that people can walk to work, use bikes to work. We have electronic scooters in our community. But we also have people who don't want any more density. They're afraid of more traffic. They're afraid of more people taxing the infrastructure. infrastructure. So that's always an ongoing tension. But I think what we've discovered in our community is that if we educate people about why we're doing something, that we can eventually win them over. If we don't talk about we want to build more housing, but we talk about having a healthier community, if we talk about actually solving traffic by creating greater ability to walk or bike to work, then they begin to get on board.
Good. How do you communicate then? Is it part of your advice, Charles, is to say, let's lay out a mapping of what are the priorities for your city, but this has to extend to communications, as Gleam was suggesting, you have to articulate to people where you're trying to go with this mapping, right?
Yeah, it's certainly true. Honestly, we need to, our challenge as a firm actually has been to take the evidence, which sits in boring academic papers, and sorry, some of my favorite researchers are in the room here. Their work sits on, on the stacks in university libraries, and to translate that into stories that can affect change. And so when we talk about mobility, Mayor Davis has talked about people saying, you want to take my car away. This is not about taking the car away. This is about providing more options and more freedom. So we use that language. We're talking about freedom. We're talking about, do you care for your children? Do you care for their safety and their health? We want to create places for them. It's that kind of language.
Good. There's a big push here in Dubai. We've seen it with the rail transport that's been put in that reaches all the way to the airport to try to relieve some of the congestion. His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid is very into autonomous vehicles, the ability for drones to do delivery to ease up traffic. It sounds almost like the Jetsons cartoon that we've enjoyed in the 60s and the 70s. But it's kind of an inflection point. Would you suggest that is the case, Charles? And I'd love to get your follow-up input. Are you thinking in that sort of realm as well? Do you have to think about the future that far out? If I went into the Museum of the Future, I had a glimpse into what the future looks like and the next 75 years of what it has to offer. But in the next 10, autonomous vehicles, the ability for mobility to ease some congestions, improve the quality of life?
I have two thoughts on that. And in Dubai, you need to recognize how compelling it is to see these visions of the future or of the present that are impressive and novel. At the same time, the truth is an autonomous vehicle, if it's running on the surface of the earth, it takes up the same amount of space as a vehicle with someone driving it, with the kids in the back. In other words, when you're dealing with congested cities, autonomous vehicles are not going to be the solution. The solution is to provide more alternatives. In fact, the smart city of the future might look a little bit more like some of our best cities created in the past. Walkable places where we all want to go on vacation, the heart of London, Paris, Barcelona.
Good. If you remember, California, it predates us, I think, as children, but 1940s and 50s, they ripped out the rail systems, right?
That's right.
To put in freeways and put in cars. We're going back to the future in a sense.
In a sense, but I think one of the things that we keep saying in Santa Monica is we do have people who sort of long for the good old days, if you will, when there was no traffic and Santa Monica was a little quieter city. And we remind them that we're planning for 2050, not 1950. And I think that's really important. That's your point about keeping people focused on the future, not what they've left behind, because we can't reconstruct those old cities. What we can do is keep focusing on the future. We talk a lot about the city that people want to build for their children and grandchildren. For example, because we're so small and such a desirable place to live, our well-being survey shows that people don't believe their children are going to be able to live in Santa Monica. And that's a real problem. People want their children to be able to live in the community that they grew up in. So that helps us address things like affordability and inclusion in Santa Monica and gives us a real impetus to move forward with some of the happy city principles that Charles talks about.
Okay. Affordability is a huge issue, right? This is a thing that's been percolating in San Francisco. It's an issue here in Dubai. I know they're wrestling with it in Abu Dhabi. What's innovation when it comes to affordability, and how do you do mapping for that, Charles? And I'd love to get some of the innovations you're trying to do to make it more affordable to stay put. Go ahead.
It's funny, I live in a city that keeps winning global awards for livability and happiness, Vancouver, Canada. And the pictures look great, but actually we've fallen off the cliff on well-being because many of us can't afford to live there anymore. So Vancouver is realizing that the secret to building a happier city is actually to intervene in invisible ways, using policy around affordability. So we now have a speculation tax, we have a foreign buyers tax, and suddenly we're seeing price changes. Another thing on affordability, you know, for Americans, some Americans spend 30% of their income on transportation. So if we want to build affordability, that might just mean a better land use plan, so you don't have to make 6 or 7 driving trips a day, maybe just one.
You know, we're always behind the curve when it comes to policy. I remember this surge of Chinese money that was coming into Vancouver. And one of the segments I do for CNN is called 1 Square Meters. We look at, you know, trends in investment or game-changing developments along the way. Everybody was so excited about the Chinese money coming into Vancouver. And then we wake up and say, oh my gosh, it's made it so expensive. So what's the advice to somebody like Gleam to say, watch the trends carefully before you embrace this wholeheartedly? Can you moderate what's coming into a city at the same time?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge that, you know, Vancouver is a city that's partly built by Chinese. So when we speak about speculation in Vancouver, we don't attach that label to a particular nation or race, although, you know, certain nations have been pouring more money in. The issue is speculation. So we are developing tools in Vancouver to counter speculation, like the taxes I mentioned to you. But there are also other forms of housing that are affordable to more people that are of less interest to speculators. For example, co-housing, a Danish model of housing where a group of families get together, maybe 25 households, hire an architect, build a little community for themselves. Speculators aren't interested in that model. And guess what? People who live in that form of housing save up to $1,500 a month on childcare because they're supporting each other. So we see the future of affordable housing being more a future where people are sharing, helping each other out, and living in these connected communities.
Okay, I go to Vienna 2 or 3 times a year, usually for coverage of OPEC, and it always scores high, Vienna, Austria, on quality of life. So it seems Santa Monica is a little bit different because it's like a sub-city of a gigantic, sprawling city, right? But what are the attributes would you suggest in a city of that size, 1 to 1.5 million? Munich always scores very high on livability. We could pose it to Charles and see these attributes that you would like to have yourself. But it's interesting, is that the ideal city of the future? Not too big, not too small, offers culture, not too crowded. They've thought through green spaces, offer a lot of art. What's the DNA of these cities in your view?
Well, unfortunately, we can't all be Vienna because it was built a long time ago when there were different forces at play. But it's interesting you mentioned Vienna because they win the awards too, like Vancouver, except they began investing 100 years ago in a vast network of affordable housing, city-owned housing, supportive housing for their residents. So if you're Viennese, your kids will still be able to live in Vienna because they have this network of non-market housing. This is essential for places like the Emirates as well. If you want to keep a population of active, engaged workers. Anyway, the list goes on. There's mobility you need to think about. In the end, we often say, think about children. Children are the indicator species of good cities. If you see children out on the streets playing carelessly,
indicator species of a good life.
Yeah, I guess they're humans, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. No, it's good. It makes sense. But that's very true about Vienna because there's a lot of green space and a lot of open space. Is that critical?
And slow streets.
Slow streets in terms of traffic and safety.
In terms of, okay, Vienna's great, but if you want to see the ideal happy community, there's a place in Germany called Wellbeing, a small community where the speed limit is 5 miles an hour. And you're not allowed to park your car in front of your house. This way everybody starts their day. I know this sounds like a fantasy here, but it happens and people love it and they're paying more for it. You have to park your car in a garage at the edge of the community. Everybody begins their day with just a short walk, not a long walk, Emiratis, don't worry. But it's long enough so you meet your neighbors on the way to take the train or to get your BMW.
Okay, Gleam, I'd love to get your thoughts on Santa Monica because when I go back home, if you will, to visit, they always say, it used to be you could drive from, say, 9:30 to 12 o'clock without traffic. And if you left after lunch, you had like a 2 or 3 hour window without traffic. Those days are absolutely gone.
They are gone.
So how do you preserve quality of life if you're a subsection of such a grand city and try to boost the quality of life, livability indexes and the rest, because you're surrounded by sprawl. That's the reality.
We are surrounded by sprawl, but one of the things we did was fight very hard to bring light rail into town. So now you can hop on our Expo light rail and get all the way to downtown Los Angeles without ever having to use your car. On the issue of affordability, we also are trying to build a lot of deed-restricted affordable housing. But we figure by making it less necessary to have a car, because a car is such a large expense, you can make it more affordable for people if they don't have to have that expense. So we've now found that about 20% of the people who live in our very small downtown area do not own a car. And that makes it easier for them to live in Santa Monica. The other thing that we've tried to do in order to preserve our community is work on the most economically disadvantaged portions of our community. So we have one neighborhood, the Pico neighborhood, where we were experiencing a lot of displacement. We have speculation. It's not necessarily foreign speculation, but we just are in such a desirable community and so small. Lots of people coming in, driving up land prices. And so we are doing what's called a Pico planning process that is different than just zoning, how big, how tall, how much floor area ratio, that sort of thing, but working with the community to try and come up with a planning process that preserves their history, preserves their culture, and will help put a halt to some of the displacement that we're seeing. And so far, we're starting to get some good results. What we're finding is with a combination of zoning and community engagement, that there's less speculation in that neighborhood because they're looking for more innovative solutions like the co-housing that Charles was talking about. And that's really making a difference.
It's fascinating because in San Francisco, you never would have thought about this idea of the level of homelessness, which we see today. So Silicon Valley has moved north into San Francisco. The property prices have gone up. Millennials want to live in the city. And there's a challenge even in Santa Monica. I notice in my hometown of Santa Barbara, homeless is a big issue. How do you factor this in? Not just the displaced who've been bought out by somebody else who's making a land bet, but how do you manage the homelessness that you face in Santa Monica as a policy?
Well, what we've really done is we devote a lot of resources to it, both monetarily and human. We have a director of homelessness policy who works within the region, because homelessness in California is really a regional issue. We don't have walls around our cities. And we're doing things, for example, we're getting our public safety officers involved. We have a homeless liaison program where we actually have police officers and counselors go out together and get to know the people who are experiencing homeless on our streets. And we work with them. And so, for example, we've identified people who came to California looking for the Hollywood dream. It didn't work out. They ended up homeless. They don't really have any mental health or serious issues or addiction issues. And so we actually pay to reconnect them with their families, send them back to their families in other locations. One of the things we've been trying to do with people who are experiencing addiction is we have housing first, which is get them into housing, and it's called permanent supportive housing, so that they have a counselor right there on site to work with them, get them to AA, that sort of thing. But we still just don't have enough housing for everybody. We're working with the federal government to try and find housing for vets, and we're also working with state and our county governments to try and build both some bridge and permanent housing. But in the meantime, it really is just about recognizing these are people and treating them with dignity and trying to work with them one by one. For example, our fire department knows that a lot of its calls have to do with homeless medical emergencies. So they're now actually putting EMTs proactively on the street to go out and reach out to the homeless and make sure they're getting some basic level of medical care so they don't have so many medical emergencies.
Excellent. The final words then to you, Charles. This is interesting because it's innovation in a very different way. So when we talk about the incubator of a good life, what is innovation in your view when you come to cities? It's just thinking very differently of practical solutions. Gleam was talking about micro grants that help bring community together as well. What would you say are the top 3 innovations that you see in terms of policy innovations? It's not an easy question, but how would you see it?
Thank you. They're not always exciting. So I would say, first of all, understand that your best mobility plan is actually a great land use plan. Second of all, housing is a right. And also, I'm going to leave you with complexity. The great cities are complex places. We tried to simplify them for a century. We need to let go of that. And I think the work we've done actually with Her Excellency Yehuda Rumi is an example of this. For example, the communities of the future here, the happier communities, if they follow the plan that we've been building out with the ministry, are going to be complex places. What does this mean? Well, the Sheikh Zayed housing program provides housing for Emiratis. Too often in the past, these places have been out in the middle of nowhere. People are disconnected. The new plan is build more walkable, complex places that include many more uses, but they also include more people. These will give Emiratis the opportunity to live with people, with foreign nationals. Why is that really important? Because foreign nationals are willing to live in apartments above shops and services. In other words, so it serves the foreign nationals, it serves Emiratis because now they can walk to things and they have more services. So it will work better for everyone. I think this represents a place that's trying a new approach.
Great. Charles Montgomery and Gleam Davis, nice to meet you. We're fellow USC Trojans, which we didn't know. So we were fight on. We need a better football team. It was better in the past. That would help the city a little bit. A nice round of applause, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.